They use their cart, their donkeys, their horses. They're using their, half-destroyed cars to just move around. And then this 15-minute trip turns into an hour for each patient, for each ambulance. So you can imagine the frustration. These patients die on the way, but we had to take it because we don't have any other option. Like, what are we gonna do? Just like watch them die, or just
This is Dr. Majid Jaber's exasperated voice. At barely 25 years old, the horror he has witnessed in Gaza is more than he has been able to comprehend in his lifetime. Like the few other doctors that remain in the south of the Strip, he has encountered the different ways there that a person could die, and the impossibly difficult reality their loved ones are left with, if they remain alive. Problems that are man-made, that have devastating impacts on the weakest factions of society. Earlier this month, Dr. Majid was part of a medical team that was forced to leave the European Gaza hospital towards an unknown fate after Israeli forces told civilians in the area that it's no longer safe. It has been difficult trying to get a hold of him amid the chaos, but we finally managed to speak. He describes to me what happened on the day the orders came through.
The whole area around the European Gaza hospital was already infiltrated by the army. So it was already encircled, and we knew. And the previous days were filled with bombardments, a lot of injured people. There was a building next to the European Gaza hospital close by that was destroyed. About 15, 13 people killed, 7 wounded, mostly children and women. And it was going to happen. Okay. And so I left the European Gaza hospital the day before the evacuation to see my family around the evening. And then it happened.
Thousands of civilians already displaced several times over have had to make another difficult decision to move yet again. And this wasn't the only mass displacement in the month of July, which is still not over. About 80,000 residents in Gaza City in the north were also forced to leave their homes or shelters. Their pleas for mercy so far have fallen on deaf ears, causing humanitarian groups to sound the alarm yet again that they are incapable to cope with the needs and the toll that these mass displacements have taken on their very limited and dwindling resources. For 9 months, Palestinians in Gaza have had to uproot and seek shelter in increasingly dangerous so-called safe zones, where conditions are dire, services are lacking, diseases are rampant, and airstrikes can come at any moment. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, now estimates that 9 in 10 people are internally displaced in the Strip. That's 1.9 million people, including many who have already been displaced 9 or 10 times. Israel's army makes the case that evacuations are designed to protect civilians from hostilities. But even in war, these orders come with a pretty strict set of rules that observers on the ground say are not being upheld. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, we examine the devastating cycle of displacement in Gaza 9 months on, and the different ways the international humanitarian laws are being ignored by the warring sides. Dr. Majid worked both as an emergency doctor and a medical practitioner. That means he has had patients in his care with chronic and rare diseases, some of whom he has treated for long periods of time, forming real connections with them.
These people come under my care and my responsibility, and I had to take care of them because I've seen them for months and months, and I want them to survive. So the Ministry of Health didn't have a plan to evacuate any patient. Everyone had to figure this by themselves. And some of the patients don't have a family, but some of these patients, they needed an ambulance. They needed an oxygen gas tank. They needed constant monitoring.
When the evacuation orders came through, one of his patients, Dawlat, an older woman with lung fibrosis, was among the many vulnerable people in his care.
Normally, these patients are discharged with a gas tank, an oxygen tank. But we don't have gas oxygen tanks anymore. We don't have gas filling stations anymore. So what happens is these patients, even though we can discharge them, we keep them in the hospital, in the wards, to just receive the oxygen. And this is bad because the hospital is an infectious environment. and we have to evacuate her now. What shall we do? We don't have an oxygen tank, but we have to risk it. We don't have any other option. Either she stays, gets killed, or we just, take the risk, inform her of the situation, and let's get on. Let's just do it, guys, okay? Dawla died the next day because she couldn't survive the transport. She died. One is Malak. She's a 14-year-old patient in the ICU. She has cerebral palsy. She has cerebral palsy is caused by brain damage during birth usually. And she is basically paralyzed and she needs constant care. You need to put a tube to her stomach to feed her. She needs proper care because she might aspirate the food, aspirate her own mucus. We transferred Malak, and I wasn't there with her. She also died that night. She could have survived in the hospital if she stayed.
That's the harsh reality people face. Injured patients who were piling in amid a week of intense Israeli airstrikes had to be transferred too, some on stretchers or in bandages. One patient had a cardiac arrest on the way and died. And what would have otherwise been a relatively short 20-minute trip became a rocky, risky, and life-threatening hour-long drive because of all the rubble and damaged roads on the way in Khan Younis, where more than 80% of the buildings have been destroyed and nothing has been unviolated by war.
These people were displaced already when Khan Younis was invaded, when Rafah was invaded. And they came back to some of those areas. They tried to fix their homes. They tried to fix the water lines. They started to have some kind of stability in their lives. And then these orders came through again. This is psychologically damaging. Like, when am I ever gonna settle, at least for a bit?
Even though the evacuation orders were given to Khan Younis residents, it wasn't entirely clear if or how the hospital would be affected yet. Dr. Majid and his colleagues had to make a difficult decision.
I came back to the European Gaza hospital because, first, we're understaffed already. And second of all, a lot of doctors and healthcare workers just escape. They just leave. They have families. They have families inside the hospital. So they were busy just evacuating their own families. A lot of people who have patients who are amputees, injured, paralyzed. It's a misery, it's a tragedy, really, and I can't blame anyone for it. What the Israelis do sometimes when they want to scare the population is they send these pre-recorded messages, voice messages, and they call everyone in mass. And they receive this message, this general message to everyone in this area. This is a danger zone. Please leave this area. What we don't know exactly is that whether the army called the Ministry of Health to evacuate. We know that some doctors were called directly by name, just leave, This is not a joke, get outside the hospital. Or we know for sure is that some medical delegations who were in the hospital left preemptively.
These are mostly foreign delegations of medics, he says. As more medics understandably seek their own safety, the already unraveling healthcare sector in Gaza becomes even weaker. Patients have a higher risk of dying, and the emotional toll it takes on the doctors continues to mount.
I don't think there is something in this life that is going to make me feel better about myself. Yeah, these deaths could have been prevented had we had a better staff, better equipment, better medications. I'm not able to reconcile a lot of deaths. I'm not able to... I don't think I even want to feel better about this. This is a tragedy by all parameters.
Nowhere is safe in Gaza. This stark warning has been echoed time and time again from aid workers, from diplomats, and from the people themselves, who oftentimes scream these words desperately as they look for refuge. Hisham Mohanna, Gaza's spokesperson for the International Committee for the Red Cross, says the people's needs are overwhelming.
We have a dedicated hotline that has been receiving phone calls from families who want to learn about, the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones who went missing, from families who are trapped in the fighting and wanted to evacuate, from families who seek to have assistance from the ICRC to help them with the inhumane living conditions they have been forced into, with the endless rounds of displacement since October 7th, since last October up until now. Following the evacuation orders that were issued in in Gaza City last week, we have received hundreds of phone calls from families who wanted to evacuate, especially with that these evacuation orders were unclear. They caused confusion and panic for the people that they could not make a decision. For many of them, it's a life or death decision to move or to stay. We take every request very seriously, very promptly, and we try to help everyone that reaches out. Sometimes it's not fully up to us because we are also limited on the capacity, logistical capacity, with the ability to handle everything. Sometimes we have faced multiple occasions of blackouts where there was like no telecommunications at all. And that also contributes to the success or failure of having people reach safety. Of course, there is no safe place in Gaza, with 100% guarantee. One of the significant results of having wars in populated cities, the consequences are unbearable. The level of destruction we have witnessed in this special conflict is beyond imagination. Like, for example, in Khan Younis, according to the reports from the UN, there is no single facility or building that has not been damaged partially or completely. The vast sector of the infrastructure has been taken out. So even when people have to evacuate, if they could evacuate, they still have to go through severely impacted roads and infrastructure with an unassessed level of weapon contamination that could put, risk to their lives or endanger their lives. And we have witnessed many cases of people, children, getting seriously injured and suffered from amputations because of such the explosion of war remnants. And then people had to move to areas that are not equipped with the basic essential needs they need: enough food, clean water, access to bathrooms, access to healthcare, and above all, the sense of safety and security. And they have been stuck in this endless loop of fighting and displacement for more than 9 months now. This is beyond anyone's ability to adapt. And there's no coping mechanism that can help civilians survive this nightmare.
So how have these commands for mass displacement gone largely unstopped for so long? Israeli authorities claim the aim is to protect civilians, but a death toll of more than 38,500 Palestinians has challenged that claim and put into question just how much Israel is doing to minimize civilian casualties. Kenneth Roth, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, spoke to me about Israel's actions in Gaza following an attack on Mawasi camp last week, an area that Israel designated as a safe zone. But last week, it killed at least 90 people and injured 300 more.
Israel has been committing war crimes in Gaza by attacking civilians, such as when it creates free fire zones or attacks the family homes of Hamas fighters, when it pummels populated parts of Gaza indiscriminately, leaving a wasteland of destroyed neighborhoods, when it attacks military targets in a way that causes disproportionate harm to civilians, such as its use of huge 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated areas, or its destruction of most of Gaza's hospitals because of a supposed Hamas presence there, when it holds detainees in inhumane conditions so that 27 detainees have died and some have had to have their limbs amputated because they were bound so tightly, and when it obstructs humanitarian aid to the civilian population of Gaza as part of Netanyahu's starvation strategy. In the case of al-Mawasi, Israel dropped 8 huge 2,000-pound bombs. Each can kill people within a 200-meter radius. It is no surprise that 90 were killed and 300 injured. That was not a serious effort to take all feasible precautions to spare civilians, as international humanitarian law requires, especially because Israel had deemed it a safe area and then ignored that designation and bombed it.
Forced displacement is prohibited under international humanitarian law, or IHL for short. There are special exemptions to this rule when the lives of civilians come under threat. But this is not a carte blanche. Hisham tells me there are very strict conditions for this exemption.
Evacuation orders, according to the international humanitarian law, have certain criteria. First, they have to reach people in a timely manner. They have to be clear in a sense that people can receive them in time, understand them. There has to be clear, safe pathways given to the people with clear timing. In addition, the members of the same family must not be separated. And many families got separated because of the displacement. Eventually, families, civilians, must be able to return to their homes after the hostilities end. Now, that could be a general term, but eventually it has to be timely bound. But I can assure you that basically the consequences, the humanitarian consequences of that, for many are irreversible. We have been receiving thousands of calls by families who are trapped, who wish to evacuate and could not because of the hostilities, because they are caught in the fire, because they get shot at. And some of them chose to stay because they know if they move from, for example, from Gaza City to the south, they will have nowhere to stay. They will have no tent. They will not be able to secure enough food. And many of them do not have enough food also in the north. And as a reminder, civilians are protected all the time. Even if they chose to voluntarily to stay where they are, their homes, they remain protected. And this is an obligation, legal obligation on both parties to the conflict. According to the international humanitarian law, there are principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions that must apply all the time. The rules of war are clear.
With UNICEF reporting that some 17,000 children have been separated from their families in Gaza, and UN figures suggesting about 60% of Gaza's entire infrastructure has been damaged, it appears that at least in some of these evacuations, laws are not being followed in reality. Hospitals have not been spared either.
We have witnessed that many hospitals have come out of, were pushed out of service due to significant military operations conducted, whether inside the premises or in the vicinity. And there are specific rules for this as well. Hospitals are protected. When there's military operations conducted in the premises of hospitals, in the vicinity of the hospitals, there can be situations that hospitals lose their protection as a healthcare facility if it's used for military purposes. And I'm not saying that this is the case, that what happened over the past month. I'm just telling you what the IHL says. However, even if hospitals lose this protection that the IHL gives, civilians inside, including the patients, the injured, the healthcare workers, and other civilians, must be protected. Healthcare workers must be given the chance, the opportunity to continue performing the life-saving activities. This hospital has to be constantly fed with all the medical supplies, with food, with water reserves and fuel to keep it operational as a healthcare facility. Again, I'm not an IHL expert, but this is the basic knowledge that is accessible for everyone, especially the parties to the conflict.
Displaced Palestinians are exhausted. They live in a constant state of uncertainty and indignity, and even if it all ends today, the road ahead is a difficult one.
The impact of these evacuation orders are still present and will be present, sometimes even after the ceasefire or after this conflict comes to an end, because the majority of the population have lost their homes and there's many irreversible consequences. The level of unspoken pain, psychological trauma, and scars. Imagine like generations of children have been out of the school system for months. Their classrooms had turned into shelters. Many schools were damaged and bombed. And I don't even imagine how children can return to these classrooms. Humanity has failed in this test because people are so much desperate and they are in need and they don't care who is responsible, who is not. They only care about surviving. They only care about providing food for their children. People have dignity. People here are so proud. They have never faced that level of inhumane conditions before.
We continue to bring you the latest from Gaza on thenationalnews.com. This was Beyond the Headlines. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and Arthur Edison. Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.